Jerome, good afternoon and welcome to our happy hour session, Building the Right Support in the Home. Widening the range of housing options for people with learning disabilities is a recurring theme in much of the work that we and our partners are doing. Recent research by LDE and Housing LIN has reinforced the need for further action to address barriers to housing and housing inequalities faced by people with learning disabilities. So I'm delighted to welcome our three speakers and our audience to our session today. We'll be hearing from Claire Skidmore, National Housing Lead at NHS England and Improvement, Sam Clark, CEO from Learning Disability England, and John Verge, CEO at Golden Lane Housing. As Jerome said, please do post any questions that you'd like to ask our speakers, and we will pick these up for the Q&A session. With no further ado, I'll hand over to Claire. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me, Ian?
Yes, perfect. Yeah.
Good. Okay, great. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this webinar. I am the National Housing Lead for the Learning Disability and Autism programme at NHS England. And I'm part of a housing team, which I'll tell you more about in a moment. So just as an introduction, the housing programme within the Learning Disability and Autism programme at NHS England is really aiming to ensure people with a learning disability and autistic people get the help they need to find and maintain a home which is right for them. And we're talking about a true home rather than a residential placement is what we aspire to provide security, stability, promote health and well-being, and really importantly, prevent admissions to hospital and enable people to be discharged from hospital into a home which suits them and meets their needs. So the National Housing Programme is about two areas of focus really. One is about the Housing Capital Programme, which I'll tell you more about in a minute, but it's also about providing support for leaders locally, regionally and nationally to really help them to build in, embed housing into the heart of their commissioning. And we are very aware at NHS England that we're one part of a system. We're partners with people working in local authorities and housing providers and many others who all play, and people and families themselves who play an absolutely essential role in making this possible. The Capital Programme is a funding programme which is in place to use NHS capital to purchase properties which directly support people to be discharged from hospital. And we take a highly personalised approach, and we're often funding highly bespoke housing solutions for specific people, usually. And that's a process which we work, and the regional housing leads, senior housing managers in the regions are working very, very closely with commissioners and providers in the regions and in local systems to bring those proposals forward. And I'll tell you a bit more about that and about how to have a conversation with your regional lead should you wish to. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this slide really is just to highlight the absolutely essential role that housing is playing in enabling us to achieve the objectives in the long-term plan. So all of these objectives are underpinned by lots of things, including the housing programme. And so we're supporting localities to maximise the capital programme, but we're also doing the wider work across NHS England and with other allies to deliver an improved range of quality housing options. Next slide, please. So a little bit more detail about the programme. So the role of the housing programme nationally and regionally is partly to influence and develop policy and practice. So regional colleagues are working really, really closely with local areas and regions to of course to bring projects forward, but also to develop a strategic, or to support people to develop a strategic integrated approach to planning for housing alongside health and care needs. And that's happening locally. And also very much sharing learning and knowledge of approaches and problem solving around a whole range of issues, from design, funding, delivery, commissioning, and everything in between. Nationally, in terms of my role as a national housing lead, I have some key objectives, really strategic objectives, which is about influencing the wider system in terms of housing people with learning disability and autistic people, to help people to get a home. So that means working with colleagues across government and with other partners across providers, voluntary sector, and so on. Also raising the profile of housing within NHS England and improvement and the NHS, to help colleagues to understand housing and to understand the importance of embedding housing at the heart of what they're doing. And thirdly, supporting the commissioning development work stream, which is about helping to commissioners in their work, so ensuring the housing is absolutely embedded into commissioning guidance that's going to commissioners, NHS commissioners. And obviously thinking about things like the data that we need to underpin our evidence base, and helping and developing those relationships. Next slide, please. So I want to provide a bit more information about the capital programme. So in 2016, there was a national commitment to this programme, including to making capital funding available for accommodation through the NHS. So this is obviously just one of a number of capital options that people have. The benefit is that it can be quite generous. We can fund up to 100% of the cost of the build. We fund open market purchases, so sort of one-off properties that we can then adapt extensively very often. We fund and we also fund bespoke developments, and we do support partners locally to build from scratch and fund that. We do fund settled as well as short-term and crisis accommodation, including for children and young people, as well as for adults. But the focus across the board is really on enabling people to be discharged from hospital or to prevent admissions to hospital. NHS capital funding is provided with a legal charge on the property, which means it has to be paid back if the property is sold or no longer used for the intended purpose in the future. So that could be seen as a string attached, but it does mean that we can recycle capital funding, and we can and do recycle capital funding, and that does help us to then plough money back into future housing options. So we do have a policy guidance, building the right home, which I'm sorry I should have put in this link, but I'll make sure it goes out in the slides when it goes out to you. So building the right home is our underpinning policy, which emphasises the importance that we're looking for self-contained properties, small scale, domestic and feel. That's our objective. And last year alone, we estimate that the capital programme enabled around 83 people to either avoid hospital or be discharged from hospital. And some of those people were people who've been in hospital for many years. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, I was asked to consider some of the challenges and opportunities. So here are just a few. So we all know, and so I think everybody on this webinar will be probably quite aware of most of these challenges. These are just some of many, but the experience of COVID and lockdown has, of course, been really, really challenging for many autistic people, people with learning disability and their families, especially from a housing point of view in many ways, with people being locked down in their homes. And I think in some ways that has really shone a light on some of the real challenges people are facing. I think there are ongoing challenges impacting on our capital programme, which I think also impact on many colleagues and providers and so on, including the rising cost of building materials. We are having to make more grants available to achieve the same outcome, and an overheated and undersupplied property market. Properties are being sold very quickly. We're having to move very fast and be very flexible in order to get the right properties. Not all specialist housing providers accept capital grants from the NHS, and it can be time consuming to access it. However, as I said before, it does have many advantages. It can be very generous, funding up to 100% of the cost of a development, and regional housing leads, senior housing managers work really closely with commissioners and other colleagues to support them to bring proposals forward, and would welcome approaches from you in terms of your thinking over for the next couple of years. I also wanted to highlight that there are some new resources support coming forward, funded or supported by the housing programme. We are just about to publish refreshed NHS England housing capital guidance, which will not bring in any major changes, but it will provide more clarity around some of the guidance, and that will be supported by case studies and other sources of inspiration, which Housing LIN will be helping us to share and promote. We've also developed a hospital discharge protocol developed by the Housing Association's Charitable Trust, which is currently being piloted in 2 systems, and we will be publishing that and really encouraging and supporting people to hopefully make use of it. We're also developing what we're currently calling a housing how-to guide, which is a set of extremely practical resources which Housing LIN and Learning Disability England are working with us on, aimed at people and families and also at commissioners and system leads to help provide some easy, quick access for very busy people to identify the information they most need to know at particular points in terms of how to do housing, as it were. I also wanted to highlight the forthcoming housing design guide, which is in an earlier stage of development. It's currently being scoped with a view to being commissioned later this year. And that is, to be honest, the current concept is inspired by the HAPPI design principles for older people. But clearly this is about a different group of people and will really, really focus also on the importance of personalisation and diversity of choice. So that's something we're just scoping up. Finally, I wanted to highlight the guidance for commissioners about lease-based funded specialised supported housing, which was produced by the Housing LIN, and it was published by the LGA. NHS England did support that, the development of that piece of work, and I think it's for those people who do face kind of issues, questions, dilemmas in their localities about that particular source of funding, then I think that's worth looking at. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you an example of a property which was actually a scheme which was funded in 2019. This is really the largest scheme that we would fund. It's 6 units, and so the total scheme cost was over 2 million. NHS England funded 82% of that cost, and the housing provider also contributed, as did the council, the remainder. Next slide, please. So I think this reflects the principles of building the right home, in the sense that each property has its own garden. There's a separate space for staff, but it's very much domestic in feel. It's in an ordinary street community. There's a real emphasis on ensuring people's privacy and ensuring that people have a really high quality environment and that it is their home. Next slide, please. And the interior of the properties are designed, in this case, to be very robust, future-proof design with high levels of assistive technology and passive support and surveillance for independence and choice. And some of these design principles we really are looking forward to exploring and showcasing in the housing design guide in terms of how to achieve a really high standard and recognising some of the common themes that we often or very often need to consider when we're designing the properties that or supporting partners to design the properties that we're funding, while also maintaining the focus on personalisation. Next slide, please. So this is my final slide, and this is us, this is the housing team. And so I wanted to be really transparent and tell you how to get in touch with us. So this will be on your slides. If you would like to talk to somebody in your region about a housing project which is being brought forward, which you want to bring forward, or that you're thinking about for a pipeline, then please do have a chat with your regional housing lead or senior housing manager. If you're interested in some of the broader strategic themes that you want to engage with us nationally, or you're interested in some of the resources that are coming out over the next year, then please do get in touch with me, and I'll be really happy to have a conversation. And I'll be interested in your feedback in some of the work that we're doing. Thank you very much.
That's great. That's nasty. That's great. Thank you very much, Claire. I can see we've had a few questions for you already, 4 or 5. That's great. So if other people watching have got specific questions that they want to pose around anything that Claire's kind of referred to in her presentation, please put them in the Q&A box, and then we'll pick up as many of those as we can at the Q&A session later this afternoon. We're going to move on now to hear from Sam Clark, Chief Exec of Learning Disability England. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Ian. Hello, everybody. You can see my slides, can't you? So that's always very reassuring for me. I can't move them on, though, so that's not so reassuring. That's interesting.
If you just left
yeah, my mouse wouldn't work. You know, there you go, designed to challenge me. For those of you who don't know Learning Disability England, we're a membership organisation that work to support change through different kinds of influencing or campaigning, want to kind of bring people with learning disabilities, family members and paid supporters and the organisations that they're part of together to solve problems and to do that influencing and changing. And a lot of what we do as well is about sharing information. And I just quickly want to give you a bit of context about where we're coming from with this. For Learning Disability England, when we first started looking at this issue of what was going on around housing and home and choice for people, we decided to really ground it in the UN Convention Article 19. Do disabled people have the same and equal choices as their non-disabled peers about where they live and having the right kind of support? And that was kind of that's our context for where we're coming from, really. Not to dictate what somebody should have in terms of whether they want, where they want to live, how they want to live, but do they have the same kinds of choices that other people might have in a similar situation to them? So where the wider context for this as well is that when I talk about what we have heard and our members or anything like that, we're also meaning what we've heard from people with learning disabilities themselves, family members, allies and paid supporters. And at the end of my presentation, but I think possibly going in the chat as well, there's some links to the work that Ian referred to that we did together. I think starting in 2019, 2020, like for lots of us, is a bit of a blur for me, but definitely continuing in 2020, that we called Finding Our Own Way Home. And that was really us trying to work together to understand what is going on. Because I'll talk to you in a minute about what we could find about data. Also, home and housing and where you live, how you live, who you live with has come up a huge amount in our work on social care. Because it's integral, I think, for many people. So our work as part of the COVID Social Care Task Force connected to the government with lots of partners, some of whom will be here today, but also our work as part of Social Care Futures with lots and lots of other organisations and people. This thing about home has been critical to those conversations. Loads of things we've heard from members, oh, and I can't spell conversation, and research that's still ongoing, but being led by York and Bristol University on people who have very little or no paid support in their life, but who has a learning disability, and some work that MMU are doing on value for money and quality in residential care and supported living as we know it. So some of what I'm going to share with you now is kind of an amalgam of lots of that. But I just quickly wanted to tell you, this started for Learning Disability England in late 2018 into 2019, when some of you might remember that CQC issued some statistics on a huge increase of the number of people dying in supported living. and there were some radio programs, and we were getting contacted by lots of members saying what's going on here and what's happening for people. And it was really hard to find an awful lot about where people with learning disabilities were living and with whom, you know, on a broader data set level. So what we've got are the ASCOF numbers. Now these count people 18 to 64 who get long-term support. And, you know, one of the things that we know from 1920 is that about 37% of people were reported by councils to be living with family or friends. And more people were living, 23%, a slight increase on the year before, were living in what was called supported living. And the number of people living in residential care is declining. But these are people known to councils with long-term support. So if you look at the figures from 2014, 15 to 15, 16, when the definitions change, we lose a whole load of people and we don't really know where they are, or we can't find them anyway. So what's happening for them? What we learn from all of those conversations and all of those sources is this, that I have shamelessly stolen from Social Care Futures as their shared vision. But it epitomizes what we've heard from people, which is that thing about we all want to live in a place we call home, with the people and things that we love, in communities that work for us. And I think for me, that ties right back to the Article 19, same and equal choices, support to live in the community. That has come out as people's priority on a very simple level. And that is so different for everybody, and might include really bespoke design to make somebody's house safe for them. Or it might include living in a larger intentional community because that works for them. But it is that thing about we all want to live in a place we call home. So what we learned from the Finding Your Own Way Home big housing conversation specifically, but also the other stuff, is that people's experiences are different. Depending on where you live seems to make a difference. Depending on what kind of support you get, if you get social care support, and or if you've got somebody who can help you speak up or advocate with you. We heard that choice is very limited for some people. We also learned that housing decisions get made for a whole range of reasons. So it often is not about what people want or need. We heard quite a lot about experiences of being told that the only option was a now vacant room in a shared house. We heard from commissioners that they didn't know how to create other options within their available funding. We heard quite a lot of experiences that were about being placed and not being able or supported, or knowing that you can try and build a plan that is creating the home, the place that works for you. And as I've already said, we definitely got a very strong and clear message that, you know, one kind of housing won't work for everyone. So one of the really interesting conversations that I was part of over the last year was when a man in his 20s said to me, well, and our commissioner has decided everybody has to live in their own flat, and I don't want to. So it's all this, you know, mantra that you know, lots of people might have about where you've got to be independent and live on your own. And he was like, I don't want to do that. He's actually, I think, now living in a shared lives place, which is really working for him. But it is that thing about it's got to be what works for you, and the opportunity to unpick and work out how you get to the bits that really matter for you. So I think the thing I want to keep saying is nobody was talking about large mansions and all that sort of, you know, unrealistic things. It was, I really don't want to be on my own, and that's the most important thing. Or I really do need to be on my own, and that's the most important thing. How can we make that happen? Things like that. There were some really good things to build on. There were some people we have found and heard evidence of some people that have a home that works for them. Sometimes it's because they've chosen it. You know, we heard about home ownership really working for some people. That individualized housing planning made a huge difference. And good information in some places is helping people work out and really understand what matters to them, and therefore create a housing plan that is the best that will work for them in their circumstances. I was talking to one family member a few weeks ago who was saying that somebody she knows, not her daughter, but somebody who's a friend of her daughter, lives in the same block of flats as Tom Daly, the diver, because he lives in the penthouse. But when the block of flats was being built near the Olympic Village, the council got nomination rights from an RSL owns some of the flats in this huge block. The council got some of the nomination rights. This young man now lives there. And how cool is that? I think he might hang out a bit too much in the lifts waiting to see if Tom's coming home. But anyway, that's his thing. The things that people with learning disabilities and families, but also paid supporters of all kinds, said to us, people just wanted to have those same options. That really simple stuff about housing, a home, choices that work for you in or near your networks, good information on your rights and understanding what is possible. So lots of people did not know what was possible. And one of the things we hear from family members is often family members don't understand that they might be able to help make this happen, or there might be options that make that work. And a really strong thing about advocacy for people who don't understand their housing rights. I'm not going to say a lot about this, but because I think John's going to talk about some of this, but the kind of things that we thought for policy or practice were really important was something about a national standard about what your housing rights were. Much more flexibility in the funding system so that we could make some things work. Removing some of the barriers to the capital money, if that was possible. The hold programme being a bit more flexible and a bit more available for people, so more people could have shared ownership. And housing related support being more readily available for the people who don't need loads of support in their lives, but just somebody, something being around, so that A, they can manage it, but B, there is somebody who might help solve things if things go wrong. And you can see these links, but I wanted to share with you Jodie and Jordan's films are brilliant, and please watch them. And I'm not going to try and show them now because that sound always gets very stressful on Zoom, but they're really worth watching, because one of the things that both of them really clearly talk about, and I think is a significant message we got from people and families, was that the first thing they did when they moved out of a family home didn't work. And actually, that's got to be all right, because it won't always work.
Brilliant, Sam. Thank you. Thank you for that, giving us that sort of breadth of diversity and that really strong message about, one size not fitting all, and that, we need a range of options for people. Thanks, that's great. And thank you to everyone who's attending. We actually, the number of people attending is actually going up as we're speaking, so that's fantastic. Please keep posting your questions in the Q&A box, that's great. And now we're going to hear from John Verge, who's CEO at Golden Lane Housing. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Ian. Hopefully you can hear me all right.
Yeah,
we can hear you. Yeah.
Fantastic. Perfect. Great to be here. Nice to see everybody. If there are any internet issues, let me know, Ian, and I'll turn my camera off, but hopefully I've got a stable internet this afternoon. So I'm John Verge. I'm Chief Exec of Golden Lane Housing. Hopefully I've met many of you, but for those that I haven't met, just a bit about myself. I've been with Golden Lane Housing now for 21 years. We're a national specialist supported housing provider. and we offer housing for people with a learning disability across the whole of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. I'm also the chair of the Learning Disability and Autism Housing Network. Just want to give you a bit of information about the Learning Disability Housing and Autism Housing Network. We're made up of members from across both specialist and non-specialist housing association, and our members are acutely aware of the huge need for housing providers. Solutions vision is to provide and develop and also to deliver those housing solutions for people with learning disabilities. And as you can see from the slide, we've got three important aims. The first is to raise awareness of the housing needs and, for me, importantly, the housing aspirations of people with a learning disability. Indeed, it was 10 years ago that MENCAP published a housing report that showed that 7 out of 10 people with a learning disability wanted to live independently. And I think, as Sam has shown in her presentation, that desire has certainly not reduced over the last decade. A second important role for us is to evidence and promote the positive impact, the social value, and actually the value for money that quality housing and housing services offer. At Gold Lane Housing, we published an annual social impact report, which shows the positive impact that a good housing solution offers both people with a learning disability, but also their family and also the wider society. For us, there's clear evidence that planned, sustainable and quality supported housing can offer real solutions and real cost savings. It was 4 years ago that MENCAP and Housing LIN published a report on specialised supported housing and showed the overall cost savings that good quality supported housing can offer for those people with high support needs. So on average, it was shown that around £200 a week was saved for those that were living in inappropriate care settings, and even greater cost savings for those living in institutional settings, around about £2,000 a week compared to those living in inpatient placements. And a third important role for us is to influence that national policy, because that underpins the kind of solutions and the offers that the housing sector can actually provide to people who are in need of housing. So we're also working with other stakeholders, such as the National Housing Federation, Housing LIN, and also with Learning Disability England. So we're really keen to make that those changes that work for everybody. I just thought it would be useful just to remind ourselves of the kind of policy context that we're currently operating in and the recent developments that are happening. Now, supported housing models continue to support the government priority for community-based housing, but they also need to evolve to meet the aspirations that Sam just alluded to, and to offer that real choice to people with learning disabilities and autism. Really believe that the housing sector welcomes the continued government commitment to fund supported housing, which was threatened by the local housing allowance cap a number of years ago. But there still is inconsistencies around the interpretation of the regulations. And there's always that outside possibility of a change that could derail the housing association plans when it comes to funding. So I'll mention that in a moment, but I think that's important. We've got the commitment, but there is still that element of uncertainty. It's really important that quality and value for money is a key part of government thinking for supported housing. We've seen lots of examples recently where perhaps that quality hasn't been there, and that there's a question over the value for money and the cost of supported housing. So I think it's right that the government is focused on that. And certainly we welcome the National Statement of Expectations that was published last autumn. It does clearly set out some expectations for local authorities to work with housing providers to plan for the future supply. And it importantly stressed the importance of collaboration between local councils, providers, support providers, to actually deliver housing solutions. And also, importantly for us, recommends that supported housing fits within the wider local health and social support pathways. Now, we all know that the demand is outstripping supply, and it's all more important than ever that we work together to have a good understanding of where people want to live and what they want to live in. Now, good housing provision needs both a sustainable capital stream, but also a revenue stream. And that is important to create the conditions for growth. And last year's National Housing Federation and the Housing LIN report sets out clear recommendations to support the growth of that provision, recognises the additional requirements for capital funding and higher grant rates, acknowledged that we do need that long-term commitment to housing benefit and sufficient support funding to support people in their own homes. And as Claire alluded to earlier, we are starting to see more guidance, such as the LGA guidance for commissioners to support the development of new provision. So we believe housing associations continue to have a clear role to support commissioners respond to the current and future need. Now, our experience is where there is a joined up strategic planning approach to supported housing, you are more likely to see provision of quality accommodation that provides both the real impact for individuals and that value for money that I spoke about earlier for local government and health authorities. Now, I think we've all seen the consequence of poor planning and lack of partnership is often leads to reactive provision, and in some cases no provision at all. That results from people being forced to stay in hospitals far longer than they need to, sometimes miles and miles away from their families. We've also seen a move for more traditional housing associations who have previously provided accommodation to actually step away from providing accommodation. And we've seen that gap often filled by new players, providing accommodation through the long-term lease arrangements that Claire referred to earlier. Now, there are numerous reasons for that. The uncertainty of the welfare benefit system, focus on government on home ownership across the whole of social housing, the complexity of providing that bespoke housing. To get it right takes time, effort, and real collaborative work. And that accommodation does cost more. So the additional expense of supported housing that can't be readily provided through the traditional affordable homes programme route does create issues for housing association. So the Learning Disability and Autism Housing Network launched our charter this year. We launched it at the NatFed Housing Summit. The 4 calls for action are really intended to address some of the issues that I've been talking about. So, as you can see, first, we believe that we need a more comprehensive and integrated national and local planning framework for supported housing for people with learning disabilities. Something designed to ensure that supported housing receives an appropriate share of available resources. And in particular, that local commissioners know how to access the right tools and information. It was great to see Claire talk about those tools that are coming up, but it needs to be there for everybody with learning disabilities, not just for those currently in hospital settings. Secondly, while there's been a great news that the government have ring-fenced some of the affordable homes programme to supported housing, we need a programme that doesn't just deliver for older persons accommodation. And the key to that is, I guess, our third ask is a rent setting approach for housing associations that allows for new housing to be developed under the current grant levels of around 50%. So we fed back to government that actually for higher cost supported housing for people with higher support needs, you actually need 70% grant funding to be able to charge rents under the current formula rent policy. So we think we need some more flexibility around that. And then finally, we do need that long-term housing benefit regime that allows that certainty for providers and gives them the confidence to actually develop the housing that we all spoken about this afternoon that we need. So I will pause there and share my screen.
That's great. Thank you, John, and particularly for setting out so clearly what actions you think are needed. I'm going to invite Claire and Sam to come back on screen. So if you want to join us again. Hello, Sam.
I think it's going to take 5 more minutes for Claire to join us.
Claire, I think, is otherwise preoccupied at the moment. So she'll join us perhaps a little bit later. So we've got a number of questions that people have been asking in the Q&A box. So perhaps we can look at some of those. And some of those were for Claire. So perhaps I'll come to those a little bit later. Perhaps John and Sam, there's the question from Tiffany, which is essentially asking about people with high support needs. So how can we ensure that those people who require 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 24/7 support to live well and safe and have a say in where they live? What's your sort of experience about helping people with much higher support needs to get personalised housing?
Yeah, perhaps if I go first and then pass over to Sam. I mean, I've been involved, as I said, for 21 years with Go Online, and throughout that process, we've been helping people with high support needs. You know, I was involved with some of the early NHS campus reprovision down in Cornwall, in fact, with you, Ian, back in the kind of mid-noughties. And I guess it comes down to talking to the individual, talking to the person, talking to the families. It's got to be about an individualised discussion, and be brave. And I go back to discussions we were having with, you know, nurses and doctors and commissioners back in 2005 when we were helping people move out of Bew Hospital. We were told that it wouldn't work. People were putting up lots of barriers. So I think it's about just advocating for people's right, that actually it can work. Community-based housing in people's communities works, and we and others, lots of our members, Advance, Progress, we've got numerous examples of where it does work. There are examples where it doesn't work, but just because it doesn't work doesn't mean you don't, you know, carry on. So it's being prepared to take risks, being prepared to listen to people, what people want, learn from what you've previously done, but design it around the individual and what they want. They know what they want. It's about then us as professionals taking that aspirations, the desire, the expectations, and turn it into a reality.
Thanks, John. Sam?
I would completely agree with John. I think he's absolutely right. And I think a lot of it is about really working with and listening to people and working in real partnership. The only thing I'd add is that we have things like the REACH standards or the quality of life standards that were developed by Changing Our Lives that give us a framework for moving the person-centered planning conversation, the really good individualized housing planning conversation, into a set of principles that the providers, the housing and the support providers, might have in mind in designing it then. So, you know, we have lots and lots of things that have been co-produced with people and their families around what really matters, and that are very evidence and rights-based. We just sometimes need to use them, I think. But I think John's point is really important, and I think somebody put it in the chat. People will also change their minds their life will change, or it might just not be the right thing. And I think that should be okay as well. So one of the things we did hear, and I do hear from people who learn disabilities a bit, is a feeling of failing when you want to change things. And actually that's a real pressure on them, I think. So that's the only thing I'd add.
Great, thanks, Sam. Welcome back, Claire.
Yeah.
Is it okay to put you on the spot and ask a question that's been posed in the Q&A very, very early on from Neil, which I think was asked while you were speaking? I don't know if you've seen it. Neil says, I'm working with a family who have a son recognised on the dynamic support register. He's had a period of assessment and treatment following a decline in his mental health. Can the capital grant, the NHS capital grant, be used to look at new properties to prevent a further relapse? It has been identified that the current environment, his flat, is a likely trigger to his well-being.
Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, obviously there's not unlimited capital grant. We have to prioritise, but we can and do fund to support people to avoid hospital admission, as well as to enable a discharge from hospital. So you know, every year there are people who we're funding and supporting local partners to develop housing for people who are at risk of hospital admission. So that's definitely the case. And I would recommend that you talk to your local, your regional housing lead if you haven't already, and have a conversation. And you know, the decision about funding, I should have said earlier, is a regional decision. So the final decision is made regionally, and that's where the priorities are made. But that conversation with the regional housing lead is definitely a great starting point.
Great. There's been a few references to shared housing during the presentations. There was a question from Fran. Is there any, and it's probably a question for everybody, is there any national work ongoing looking at the strategy for shared housing for people with learning disabilities? We are coming up against local authorities who are ending shared houses, but we see the benefit for this type of housing for people. So I'm just, for all of you really, there's a lot of people living in shared housing. It's been around for a long time. Sam, any initial thoughts on that?
And I think we would just say, yes, we heard. It comes back to that whole thing about ideally, locally, you would be working with people locally to understand what is needed, and what the people who are in your population, your citizens, want, and working out how to make that happen. I think that one of the things that I would reflect on, and this is a personal view, is that we should learn from some of our mistakes of the past and understand the shared houses that have not worked or have become a longer term challenge. Because if three people have lived together for 20 years, a new person moving in is a real challenge for anybody, isn't it? So we need to understand what those houses are about, how they work, and try and build them with people and families. But I think from our point of view, we hear that that's something that some people want. And we shouldn't assume that they don't, but it's got to be that co-producing it locally with your providers, your people, your families, your commissioners, where you can, to understand what's going on, in my view.
John, what's sort of GLH's kind of view about
well,
that?
we do a mixture, and I think it's certainly the case that we're developing more self-contained in the last 5 years, more than we did 20 years ago. But we're still doing shared accommodation because it comes back to what Sam said. It's about choice. What do people want? And I see someone's put in the question around people have different housing choices through their life. So we've done what you'd call more student type accommodation, where people are in their 20s, and we've also done shared accommodation for people in their kind of older persons type accommodation. So I think it's about giving the choice. It does worry me sometimes where I'm speaking to a commissioner in a local authority, and I won't name them, but 1 year they were only commissioning self-contained, and then the other year they were only going to commission shared. And when you actually probed why they were doing it, it didn't have anything about choice. It was around, they decided that it was the cost model worked better for them. They thought that it was going to be cheaper to do it self-contained, and then they realised that it may not be necessarily the case, so they've moved the other direction. So I think for me, it should be a mix of different types of options, and and then it's about designing that for the individual. I mean, we've got a real demand for flatted schemes, and we're doing some at the moment, and that's fine. But as soon as you start developing a new build scheme that may not be ready for 3 or 4 years, and will be on a scale that is perhaps larger than certainly we're used to developing in the past, that personalization does get removed. That's the reality. And then you get the situation where the commissioner has decided that actually they're going to just develop self-contained flats, and then I get families ringing me up saying the only option that they've got, and the only thing that are being offered, is this 1-bedroom flat in a town that's not necessarily where my son or daughter want to live. They'd much rather live with a friend down the road from us, but that's not an option because the local authority have said that they've got the only offer that they'll be given is this new build block of flats. So I think it's a balance, isn't it? It's about a balance of, for a lot of people, 1-bedroom flats is exactly what they want. So we got to respond to the expectations.
Claire, do you want to wrap that up in terms of, does NHS England and Improvement have a sort of formal view on shared housing?
We don't have a formal view on that. Sorry, I'm being asked biscuits.
No.
I'll get you a biscuit in a minute, Oliver. 2 minutes, please.
I'd like a biscuit.
Sorry. A chocolate. So no, except that in terms of the capital programme, we have an emphasis on self-contained, but there is a mixture of housing that we're enabling from self-contained in the sense of a house on a street that we purchased that's a one-off to a small development in one location. And I think in terms of the support that we provide to commissioners more generally, more strategically, I think I would just agree with what everyone said. A housing options approach that recognises that people are different, and that people are different from each other, and they're also different at different times in their life, just seems only reasonable. First of all, it's only right, and I think where areas are saying, oh, we prefer XYZ model, it does worry me, because that's not how the rest of us have to live. So it just doesn't seem right to me. But also, certainly our experience with the people that we're focusing on in our programme is that there's a very real benefit to all of us to getting it right, because if we get it right, then the person will successfully have a positive life in that housing solution. If we get it wrong, that person might end up in the hospital and have a really poor outcome. So that's, and many of the people who we support find it very difficult to share. Not all. So I think it has to be about what's right for the person.
Great. Thank you, Claire. That's great. There's a couple of questions about the HOLD programme, home ownership for people with long-term disabilities. So I think, Sam, when you were speaking, Rachel asked a question if you could say a bit more about that. And also Jackie's asked a much more specific question about any work that can be done with the court protection on the understanding the HOLD scheme in terms of reducing delay. So I'm assuming that's to do with appointing deputies. Sam, do you just want to say a little bit more about it from LDE's perspective and the perspective of...
Well, I was thinking you might be better placed to do that, Ian, than I might. I am absolutely no expert on any element of the technical aspects of the whole programme. But essentially it is a shared ownership programme that is specifically aimed at people who meet the criteria of having a long-term disability. But Ian, I don't know whether you want to say any more about that. We can send out some links and stuff. I wouldn't want to get myself into trouble by saying things that are beyond my knowledge. John, you might know more than I do.
I was just going to say one of our members, Advance, is the expert in the field. And I would suggest Graham Jackson or Ian Gilders at Advance would be the best people to speak to. I know they'd be delighted to share what they do. We've done a bit in the very early stages, but we decided actually early on that Advance were the experts in it, and they work with a mortgage broker to support people with learning disabilities and mental health into long-term, home ownership, and they do a fantastic job.
So there may well be someone here from Advance today. If not, we can put their details in the information that goes out afterwards, and certainly Graham or Ian's kind of contact details. I think, sorry Sam, I wasn't asking you to give us a detail of the program. More sort of, are you getting a sense from your members as to whether there's sort of growing, sort of re-emerging interest? Our experience is that the whole program has obviously been around for a long time. In the financial crash, it was incredibly difficult after the financial crash, and then it became equally difficult during the kind of initial period of kind of government austerity. Just made it very, very difficult to make the program work for as many people who'd previously been helped through it. So I just wondered whether you got a sense that your members, and maybe newer members, are becoming more interested in this as an option.
Yeah, I think we are hearing, one of the things we are hearing from people is a surprise and a delight when they find about it as a possibility. So what we are hearing is that getting the information about it as an option to the right people at the right kind of times for them to consider it can make a huge difference. And I think there is more interest. There was some nervousness, but we aren't hearing about nervousness now. But genuinely a desire for more people to be able to understand it as a choice and an option. And I see in the chat that Gary is here, and he's given us a link to Advance and their stuff. But I think it is a very significant and important point that I think it had disappeared off the radar for a lot of people as a possibility. The fees are a barrier for some people, but it is just one of many options you'd hope, isn't it?
That's great. Thank you, Gary. And also Claire has put some details in the chat. Thank you, Claire, from Homes England. And in fact, Claire, perhaps I can come to one of your questions. You've posed a question, which I think I'll kind of start with Claire and John. Claire's question was, do you think that the planning system needs to change to include supported housing in local authority strategic housing delivery targets? So I think, if I'm understanding correctly, Claire, should government actually mandate local authorities to have delivery targets around supported housing? Or indeed, are you seeing local authorities actually voluntarily putting any kind of targets for themselves in their local plans or any kind of supplementary planning documents that they're developing around supported housing? John, if that's...
Yeah. Absolutely. We got involved with the Royal Borough of Greenwich about 3-4 years ago now. They brought us in to actually co-produce their housing strategy. They'd had a disaster. They'd launched a housing strategy for people with learning disabilities, but they've got I don't take this the wrong way, Ian, but they've got a consultant in who had written it without talking to anybody, and it ended up actually with people with placards at the town hall, because basically the strategy said we'll close all the registered care homes, but they didn't have any solutions. They didn't have any opportunity, housing options. So we basically spent a good year talking to people, consulting with people with learning disabilities. We held events at the local Charlton Athletic Football Ground, and the reason why we were brought in is the Director of Social Services at the time had seen 20,000 new housing being built on the peninsula by the Thames. Not one single of those 20,000 new houses were earmarked for people with a learning disability. And he said that needs to change. So absolutely, there's huge amounts of accommodation that's being built, and it needs to be designated for people with learning disabilities. What we have been doing, and I know a number of our members have also been doing, is talking to local authorities and housing associations to say that you may not be skilled or feel skilled enough, and expert enough to actually have tenancies with people with learning disabilities. There's no reason why you shouldn't, but you may not feel comfortable. And then so come to organisations like us, and we will support you with that. So we're increasingly working with general needs housing associations to take leases, And actually, some great examples of local authorities. We've just worked with North East Lincolnshire, who've worked closely with the CCG to develop some new schemes where we're taking on long-term leases. We've done that in Hampshire recently. So there's some local authorities who actually are going, well, it's not being provided, we're going to provide it ourselves. But planning, and the various Section 106 arrangements that is there to support social housing needs to be there for people with learning disabilities and autism and other groups as well, but we often get forgotten about.
Claire, is that from an NHS perspective, is that something that you are seeing, your regional leads that you put up on the last slide, is that something that they're having more discussions with local authorities about in your experience?
Definitely, in different ways. Many of them, if not all of them, are talking to commissioners and other system leaders about really the benefits and the importance of having that relationship with strategic housing leads and planning colleagues. So even if it's not mandated to specify need for supported housing, it's clearly going to be really, really beneficial to think long term and build that into housing and planning colleagues' understanding of what's needed. And I think my experience is that they're looking for evidence, and they're looking for kind of information to help them with their planning, and I think I'm sure would in many cases welcome that conversation. Yeah,
that's great. There's a few couple of practical questions, I think, which were probably posed during your presentation, Claire. So Gus has asked a question about, I think, the development that you put on your slides, which am I right in thinking that's in Kirklees?
Yes, I think that is the Kirklees. Yeah.
A question about how many bedrooms are in the properties on the site. So look, any more detail you've got about the sort of specification?
Off the top of my head, I would have to go and check that. I haven't looked at that for quite a while. But I mean, the specifications that we, as I say, they are personalised, but often we will do 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom accommodation, and then very often there'll be accommodation for staff as well. People will sometimes need additional space, private space for chilling out, or for kind of in one highly bespoke development that we funded recently. It was for a child who needs a study space as well as a play space and a bedroom for his mum to come and stay. So it's very, very personalised, but most definitely the developments we're funding are often more expensive than perhaps finance colleagues often expect, but we're very clear that the benefits of getting it right are obviously right for the person, but also very often financially makes sense in even the fairly short term, if not in the medium to long term.
Great, thanks. Jack's asked a question about employing people. I'll pose this one to you, Sam, in the context of the kind of research that you were talking about with York and Bristol University, and then perhaps John can also contribute to this. So Jack's question is, do you believe housing associations, or presumably other housing providers, could look at employing specialised housing officers to support tenants with learning disabilities or people with autism to help them maintain their tenancies? And I'm just wondering, Sam, the kind of messages that came out of some of the research, particularly for people who are on the cusp of adult social care eligibility in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we heard quite strongly from general needs mainstream council or housing association or RSL providers was a desire for a resource, a way of being able to support their tenants who might just need some support with maintaining their home or managing things that are going on around them or things like that. There was a real desire from everybody, from the housing providers and from people themselves. And I am old enough that I remember supporting people. But when I first started working in housing 20 some years ago, you know, I worked for mainstream housing associations that got special needs management allowance, SNMA, was that right? But we had an amount of money that allowed for a more intensive housing management support, and that a desire for something that was available to support that kind of thing in ordinary general needs housing was really strong, came across strong, I would say.
I'm sorry, I was going to say the supported housing, you know, it worked, and let's be honest, it worked, and it's a travesty that it sort of floated away, so to speak, didn't it? I mean, you know, it was ridiculous that it didn't continue. Personally, I guess for me, as a specialist housing provider that has, you know, specialist housing officers, I see that on a daily basis the difference we make. I mean, I'll go back to the point I made earlier about, you know, housing associations at the moment are prioritising those with higher support needs in terms of new housing provision, because there's a demand for it, absolutely. But when I started in this, you know, 20 plus years ago, we were housing people with more moderate support needs, you know, actually who are working but did need that support. But, you know, because you know, the regulations dictate that people have to have high support needs for us to charge rents that are, you know, basically above, you know, your standard rent. A generation is being lost, you know, and it's the point that we are making, I've made to the regulator of social housing over the last year and a half, when, you know, we talk about specialised supported housing and high support needs. Well, actually, people with moderate learning disabilities have still got high support needs. They get informal support, you know, from mums and dads, from volunteers, from housing associations, and actually, you know, we do need to ask ourselves, is we are letting those people down. We are absolutely letting those people who we would have housed 10, 15 years ago are no longer being housed. And what's happening, they're moving into general needs housing, which is great, but without the right support, there's real safeguarding issues and concerns. You know, county lines, cuckooing, you know, those things are happening on a daily basis. Take away that intensive housing management, as it's now called, away from them, they are really vulnerable. And as we know from the Care Act, housing associations, landlords have got a responsibility. So it's really important that if they can't provide that themselves, that they, you know, they talk to organisations like us and other learning disability and autism housing network members to get that advice of what they need to do.
That's great, thank you. I'm conscious of the time, and we need to wrap up. So on that kind of note, John, I just wonder whether your final slide was set out a series of things that you think needed to change in policy terms. I'm just wondering, both you and Sam, and also Claire's view on this from you know, working in the NHS, is if our colleagues from MHCLG and DHSC were here today, what would be the 2 or 3 things that would make the biggest impact in terms of fixing some of these issues and widening housing choices and reducing housing inequalities? What would you say those sort of takeaway headlines are? John, if you want to.
Well, for me, a more allowing housing associations to have a more flexible approach around grant levels and being able to charge rents, that would be the biggest impact, you know. You know, again, going back, we mentioned supporting people, but can I dare to say valuing people? We need a national strategic approach for people with learning disabilities. Again, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't have to start from scratch. We've got some really good foundations, but I think sometimes it gets lost. You know, I've met many people within the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government over the last couple of years. They're all fantastic. Some have worked in the sector for a very, very long time, but there are new people that, you know, have joined in the last couple of years. They were in the transport department, you know, 2 years ago. When I talk to them about valuing people, you know, I feel like a dinosaur, because, you know, some of them weren't even born then, you know, they were perhaps at college. So, you know, we can learn from the past, but take that to the next stage.
Great. Sam, from your members' perspective, what do you think that
so just some very links to what John says, really, but some very clear a policy and expectation that people will have equitable choices and access, and that we will create the environment that allows that to happen. So for many people, that might be very small amounts of support. And for other people, you know, the work that Claire and colleagues do in NHS England is incredibly valuable, but actually there's another million and some people who, as John says, we are probably not doing a service to at the moment. So some clear expectation and resources in the right places that allow people to be able to live their lives. And, you know, I think as part of that is a whole load of genuine partnership working with people and their families to create whatever those solutions are, not to do it separately.
Thanks, Sam. Claire, final word for you, you know, so from a kind of NHS perspective, not really constrained by what you said. I thought John's point about valuing people was interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that. I remember that, and it was a thing that inspired me to come into this area of work, sort of whenever that was. So I think two things. One is I'll just go back to what Sam said at the beginning about the vision of social care future. I mean, I think that's the vision that I kind of cling to, and I think I see my role in housing as being about achieving that vision where people have a place they call home in a community and with people they love. That's what it's all about. And in terms of what I'm thinking about at the moment, change I'd like to see is for us to have that to get out of our silos. I suppose I would say this from an NHS point of view, where I think it's all about working with that wider system, and you know, we need to be modelling that at national level as well as at local and regional level, and really working with our partners across government to achieve that. Perhaps to achieve that vision that John described. That's what we should be aiming at. I think we should have that shared objective, and everything should flow from there.
Brilliant. A couple of very quick questions. John, a very quick question. Tiffany's just asked if local authorities can join LDAHM. You'll know the answer to that.
Well, it's an interesting question, because at the moment it's for housing providers, but I'm certainly happy to take that question away. And if you've got my email address, because I think we want a network that obviously enables us to focus on some of the specifics that affects housing associations, but we do want that wider conversation. Certainly we invite you know, Sam's coming to our next meeting. We have you know, senior civil servants come in. I know, Ian, you've come to meetings in the past. So we do want to make it wider. We are thinking about a sort of a national kind of event once a year where we come together, that's expanded just wider than the members themselves. So but yeah, it's an interesting question, and I'd be interested to have a conversation with my colleagues on that.
Okay, so it's okay if we pass your contact on to Tiffany. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time and we need to wrap up. Very last point, actually, Michelle Roberts, if you're still there, Michelle, really strong point. Did you think about having a disabled person with learning disability on the panel at all? And you're absolutely right, it's a really appropriate challenge, and we need to get that right next time. And I think, you know, I probably should have spoken to Sam about that. So we will make sure that next time we'll do that. Sam.
Yeah, can I just say something in? This is the first time this year I've not co-presented. And it was because although Ian asked me, I couldn't find anybody who was free to co-present with me or to be here. So it's a really fair point, and I think, you know, it's something we always try and do. But yeah, I think 4:15 this Tuesday was just not a winner in my world.
So we need to make sure we get the date and timing right next time. Fantastic. Okay, we're gonna wrap up there. So I hope everyone's found this afternoon's session interesting and stimulating. Please do sign up for any future happy hour sessions, which are advertised on our website. We've got a couple more coming up in July. They're on the same page that you would have found this one. I think we're having a break in August, and then I'll be coming back in September. I think we'll be carrying on doing this regardless of whatever other changes are going on in our wider world. You may also find the resources on our website in relation to housing with people with learning disabilities useful. I hope you do. So finally, thank you very much to Claire, to Sam, to John for sharing your knowledge and expertise with all of us this afternoon. thank you to all of you who've come along and attended, and we hope to see you again soon. And good afternoon. Thank you very much.